I'm Marc Scott. I'm the visual effects supervisor for Trolls 3 Band Together.
How did you start your career in animation?
Well, I started very young with a passion, a love for filmmaking. Animation in particular, I think, was inspiring to me because, I found it to be a very interesting and inclusive world, and where anything was kind of possible, and differences were celebrated in a way that I didn't necessarily see in the real world, and that was always appealing to me. I think that being able to create a world of that, although as a kid I didn't know that that was a job or what that was, it was still inspiring to me. And when I found out that this was an actual career, as I got older, I also started to get inspired by live action filmmaking. I grew up in the 80s and early 90s, but particularly in the early 80s, which was just an amazing time for cinema. We had so many great films. So I was really, drawn to the visual effects side of things, and then kind of found a way into animation later on in my career. So I actually started in the live action visual effects side. I started at an internship at a studio, and then eventually worked my way up by learning the kind of systems that allowed me to be able to move into actually creating the content.
Was there a particular film or event that inspired you to work in the visual effects industry?
Okay, yeah, I think in early animation, I will say that I think as a child, I remember the first animated series I was obsessed with was Speed Racer, and it combined a love of animation and cars in a unique way that is remained to this day. So I think that was a very inspiring show for myself. The early Warner Brothers, Chuck Jones, Saturday morning cartoons. I think that is all part of your childhood experience, because back in my time growing up, that was kind of all you had. There wasn't a myriad of all of that. The films of the 80s, I grew up in a magical time where some of those films just, it seemed like, every summer there was some new blockbuster. We had Star Wars as an active series. You had, you had E.T. and Raiders of the Lost Ark, and there were all these, cinema inspirations. So, for a very long part of my career, I chased that. I wanted to work on the biggest, blockbuster visual effects. But, after a while of doing that, I also realized, at the time I was starting a family and raising a daughter, and I wanted her to also be able to see the films that I was inspired by. So it kind of came back to animation in a very interesting way through family, and that I wanted my daughter to be able to see the work that I was producing. What I was making at the time, she wouldn't have seen for years. So DreamWorks, to me, was just a happy coincidence that it ended up that I worked there, and she was able to see all of the films that I was making, and that I was also able to help inspire, maybe work with others to inspire a new generation of kids who are interested in being in cinema or animation.
What are the differences between creating visual effects for live action and animation?
I think there's advantages to both, and they're two very different disciplines in some way. We tend to group it together as visual effects, and animation gets roped into that. But at the end of the day, the big difference is that you're oftentimes starting with a plate or something that you're matching to, or at least an established real-world principle in a live-action film. You go on set and you film a location, and then you integrate into that. That's oftentimes the case. In a film like Trolls Band Together, you have a world that you're essentially creating from scratch, and there is no borrow a chair or add a car to something else. I mean, that all has to be kind of created in a new and exciting way. For instance, our cars in Trolls Band Together are, actually move along the road and are warped and animate along with the characters. So that's a very different principle than something that you would, create on a live action set.
How has the visual effects industry evolved over the course of your career?
I think the biggest change for me over the years has been the speed at which we can produce content. When I first started in the industry, it was not uncommon to even for the simplest of tasks would take overnight at least to produce. Then for me, starting at that time, typically what would have to happen is you would have to send that image to film that was actually printed at a film lab. They would return it to your studio, and then you would screen it that day. And so there was this massive, almost 24-hour turnaround between your finished product and when you could actually make a change to something. On a film like Trolls, we would end up collaborating in a room, sometimes live within a session, editing a model or moving things around or painting a texture. Dailies were very interactive. We would tell an artist, oh, here's what we would like to change. And then oftentimes the artist would run back to their desk and make the improvement and come back at the end of dailies and present it in the same daily session within an hour. So the speed at which that we're able to change and make these changes, I think, you'll notice it in the richness and the difference between the visual look of Trolls Band Together and maybe previous films. It's kind of a whole nother notch above.
What challenges did you face in Trolls Band Together?
One of the big challenges is that this is meant to be a bit of a road trip, and it's meant to make the trolls are outside of their world. They're going to places they've never been before. They're seeing new things. It is a very diverse world, and it's very opposite of their world, intentionally, aesthetically. Our production designer Ruben Perez created a world, for instance, at the end of the film, Outrageous, in our third act, takes place in a giant gym city with gold and reflections and all of that, and that's very opposite of the aesthetic of the Trolls world, which is very soft and felt and fur and fuzz. So I think one of the challenges is to make something feel very different, and to make something feel like it's new and exciting in the franchise, but also it has to fit within the established world in a sense that it doesn't feel like it's part of some other movie. And the trolls also need to exist in this film as well. So I think one of the biggest challenges was trying to make a rich, ridiculously beautiful city, but with a very different aesthetic of hard surfaces and reflective materials and sharp edges, which is very opposite, but also make it feel like the trolls could exist in that world.
Since this is a third chapter, how many assets are reused from previous Trolls films?
Yeah, it's funny, almost no asset, almost no character gets untouched from the previous film. It's a very good question, because in a way you start off with a bunch of different assets from a previous film and you think, well, we can just continue making that. But the difference between the films is 3 to 4 years sometimes. The technology has changed so much, and at that point, if you don't take advantage of that new technology, you don't want to fall behind. So although the assets, the characters, they may remain the same, the technology doesn't, and so there's a bit of retooling to make sure that that character is actually able to take advantage of the new technology. So it is inspired, we do have reuse, but a lot of it has to be adjusted for the film that we're making.
What has been the biggest challenge of your career?
It's funny, I gotta say, this film in particular, Trolls 3, was I think the biggest technical challenge, the biggest work challenge. It was an incredible endeavor. And maybe that's just because it is the most recent film, but the intent of the film was to create the biggest of the franchise. And so if I had to look back at any particular film, I feel like almost like this film is my thesis of my career. I've had to rely on so many friends' help, education of the past, experiences to create something that is, anytime you try to set out to make, the biggest film of a franchise, I think you're always going to be challenged. I would say that this definitely was the biggest challenge in my career.
What is your personal definition of animation?
I think my personal definition of animation would be, I don't even think it's a style, I don't think it's a genre, I think it's a notion of taking advantage of every possible creative outlet, regardless of physical restrictions, regardless of reality. I do think that animation, although we think of animation as an animated film or something like that, I do think animation can also be in live action. If you're taking advantage of the ability to throw off all of the constraints of the world, to be able to throw off, the physics of all of it, and to create something that is otherworldly, that is opposite our world. So although it's tempting to say that animation is, something like The Trolls or How to Train Your Dragon or something like that, they're clearly animated films, I think it's more of a concept. I think it's more of an idea of branching out from reality and creating something that's unique, that isn't bound by whatever rules we have here.
Thank you so much for
Okay, I hope that was great.